Do you think every family has a villain, or is it more complicated?
I knew the exact second the laughter turned from warm to ugly, because it lifted like steam off a pot and drifted across the rented hall with those pastel balloons, and the goofy diaper cake centerpieces, and the lemon cupcakes my aunt swore were low sugar. And it landed on my cheeks while my sister, Madison, gripped the microphone like it had always belonged to her and sang out, with that syrupy little theater kid pause, that she was having another, and the room did what rooms always do around Madison, which is tilt in her direction as if the floor itself had been quietly slanted years ago, and we had all learned to stand crooked to keep her centered. Even when the banner behind me literally said my name and the little paper rattles on the table had my due date stamped in gold, I smiled, because I have learned that a smile is a prettier shield than any speech. And I watched my mother clap too hard and my father reach for his phone like he was the family press secretary preparing a statement, and I let the noise wash over me without moving a single muscle in my jaw. I could feel the old choreography trying to grab my ankles, the one where Madison does something accidental, my parents minimize it, and I swallow the moment whole like a bad pill. But today the light stuck to the sequins on my dress and reminded me I was not the girl who used to give up the front seat when Madison felt carsick in high school, or the woman who handed over the good vacation week because Madison had a window at work. Today I was the woman who had been up since dawn labeling bins for baby clothes, who had learned to breathe past nausea and those measured kicks that felt like a tiny drummer practicing under my ribs, who had paid the deposit on this haul with my own money and made the playlist and checked on the rented coffee urn because I knew my family would forget decaf, and I was not going to be shunted into the corner by a smirk and a microphone, even if the smirk came from my own blood. She leaned into the applause like she had invented biology, eyes glittering at me with that familiar dare, be mad and look small, or be quiet and look sweet, and I chose something else entirely. I chose to stand, slow and steady, and hug her in the middle of the circle everyone had formed like a ring at a boxing match, and I told her, softly enough that the nearest guests could hear, that I was happy for her and that I hoped this one came with a manual, because her first had already learned how to order snacks from the pantry like a tiny union rep, and people laughed the way they laugh when they are relieved you will not make them hold their breath, and while the laughter still hung there, I caught the eye of the events manager by the doorway and raised two fingers in the tiny signal we had discussed 2 days ago when I booked the space and asked whether the AV system could handle video, because if you let Madison own a room without a counterweight, the room will forget why it is there. The house lights dimmed a fraction, the projector woke with a soft hum, and before Madison could slide back into another anecdote about first trimester cravings like she was hosting a morning show, the opening frame appeared on the wall behind us. A still shot of my grandmother's kitchen table layered with envelopes and baby photos and the words, "Letters to Baby, press play to add yours," and the music cue, the one my husband had picked, gentle and American in the way of old road songs that make people think about car trips in summer, floated out of the speakers while faces around the room softened into that expression adults make when you hand them purpose. And the screen rolled through quick clips of my friends and cousins and the older neighbors who had watched me grow up, each one saying something ordinary and luminous about stubbornness or patience, or the way you learn to forgive yourself for being new at something important. Madison blinked like a stage light had turned on her at the wrong angle, and a few people actually sat down without looking at her, which in our family is practically an insurrection. I stepped to the side and handed the mic to my aunt, the retired kindergarten teacher with a voice that settles toddlers and politicians, and she invited everyone to grab an envelope from the basket and write a note for my baby to open years from now, one for every birthday, and she said it in that way that makes even stubborn uncles reach for a pen, and the crowd shifted from spectacle to participation, which is the oldest magic in the book, because when people have a job they stop scanning the room for the shiniest person, and Madison's shine dimmed like a candle in daylight. She tried to catch my mother's eye, but my mother was already wiping tears and asking my father how to spell the middle name he'd always wanted for a granddaughter, and the energy, the subtle wind of attention, moved back to where it had started, my belly, my story, my day, without a single raised voice or accusation, just a clean pivot like a good joke that lands. I circulated with the basket and thanked people in that low, steady tone that lets them hear you over their own thoughts, and I pressed a hand to my side when my baby thumped in agreement, and I caught Madison hovering by the dessert table, pretending to rearrange macarons while she texted furiously with both thumbs, probably laying groundwork for the evening's group chat spin. But even Madison knows the difference between applause and witness, and what the room had become: soft, focused. Writing, recording was witness, not noise. I let the playlist roll into that Motown track my father always dances to after 2 coffees, and I asked the photographer to take candid shots of grandparents bent over cards and cousins laughing with pens in their mouths. And I smiled for real this time, not as a shield, but as a small celebration of a promise I had made myself during the last ultrasound, which was that I would not let this child's first parties become a referendum on my sister's appetite for attention. By the time the projector faded to the closing frame, thank you letters drop here. People were hugging me the way you hug someone when you remember why you love them, which is not because they are perfect, but because they keep choosing gentleness with teeth. And Madison, cornered by the absence of a stage, made one last feint with a too bright laugh about stealing thunder, and I leaned in so only she could hear and told her that thunder is loud for a few seconds and then leaves you with wet hair and bad lighting, while rain actually does the work. And she blinked again. Slower this time, like the message was trying to land in a crowded inbox. Before we cut the cake, I slipped into the office with the events manager under the pretense of signing the final invoice, and I checked the little countdown I had set on my phone the night before. A quiet ticking thing that lived under my lock screen and did not require a microphone, and I moved one slider that changed a morning post from private to scheduled, because if Madison loves a live audience, I have learned to love a well-timed reveal. Then I walked back out, kissed my husband's knuckles, held the knife steady, and let everyone cheer as sugar shattered under the blade. And when the last guest left and the hall smelled like coffee and frosting and used laughter, I folded tissue paper around tiny gifts and tucked the stack of letters into my tote like contraband. Madison's car taillights disappeared down the street while my parents argued softly about whether the projector had made them look older or kinder, and I told them both it made them look like home, which is a thing I have learned to say when the truth would only bruise. And that night I slept like someone who had put a heavy box on the right shelf at last. In the morning, just after the sun slid across our kitchen table and found the stack of bottles we had sterilized, my announcement went live. Exactly when I had planned, and the call came in so fast the phone barely had time to vibrate twice before her name flashed and her voice broke into the kitchen like a siren, high and furious and breathless, and I answered with the same smile I had worn under the balloons, because the real show was finally starting. When I picked up on the second ring and heard Madison's voice come through ragged and breathless, I pictured the way she chews the inside of her cheek when something has slipped out of her grip, and I let her words pour over me, accusations about timing, about cruelty, about me using family against family, while I cracked an egg into a pan and watched the yolk settle like a small sun, because there is something centering about making breakfast while someone else is trying to unmake your morning. And when she finally gulped air, I said the line I had practiced during the last trimester class when they made us breathe through imaginary contractions. That I was sorry she felt surprised and that I had given the room to everyone last night and I was simply taking my turn now, which is not a crime no matter how hard she says it. She demanded details as if I owed her footnotes. And I told her the internet already had all the context it needed, which earned me a strangled sound that might have been her throwing a dish towel across her kitchen, and then the line went dead, which is Madison's favorite way to declare victory in a conversation she is actively losing. The thing most people would not understand unless they grew up inside our particular house is how early the choreography began, how the family weather turned warm for her and drafty for me in subtle gusts that would be funny if they were not structural. Like the time our mother bought 2 dresses for a cousin's wedding and told me I looked classic in the one with the higher neckline while Madison twirled in the other and everyone clapped, or the way our father used to tape her dance routines with 2 cameras because backup is smart, and then forget to hit record the night I won the county debate final, promising to buy the official copy later and never following through. The stories are small, domestic, survivable. And yet they stack like heavy books on a shelf that eventually bows, and by the time you are grown you have learned 40 ways to tilt your body so the shelf will not crack, which is its own exhausting craft. Madison learned that if she moved quickly and brightly the room would chase her and call it leadership, while I learned to move steadily and precisely and let the room reveal itself, which is not applause-heavy, but it does keep you from tripping, and honestly, it makes revenge feel less like a punch and more like a well-timed lever. I do not mean pitchforks and ashes when I say revenge. I mean the tidy balancing acts that allow you to exhale without apologizing. Like the minute I hung up on Madison and opened the family group chat where the recap photos were already rolling in with captions about last night, and I slid in 6 frames from the Letters Project with simple, factual lines. Grandma Doris laughing while she wrote the middle name she once told me in the garage, Uncle Peter concentrating like taxes, my father. Tearing up at a sentence that used the word grit the way he always means it, and the chat, which can spin out into defense lawyering when Madison is cornered, chose instead to send long strings of heart reactions and quiet memories of other family tables and recipes, and those impossible childhood summers when everyone smelled like chlorine and sunscreen and nothing was complicated yet. And the tone reset without me ever mentioning microphones or thunder, or who had tried to own the night. I watched the temperature dropped from storm to steady rain, and I could almost hear Madison scrolling and realizing that a room can be reclaimed without a wrestling match if you design the furniture right. My announcement, which had landed like a flat stone skipping across a lake and kicking up perfectly timed rings, was not a sonogram or a gender reveal or even a flashy job title, though it had pieces of paperwork and dates that mattered. It was, and remains for now, a set of signatures that took months of meetings and a level of patience I did not know I owned, and it sits on top of a story that begins in my grandmother's kitchen with coffee rings on the table and goes through the bank manager, who still keeps a paper calendar because digital makes him feel rushed, and it touches things Madison has always assumed would fall into her open hands by the grace of tradition, which is a dangerous assumption around objects that require stewardship more than sparkle. When she says I blindsided her, what she means is that I did not invite her to weigh in on a decision she thought would eventually be announced at one of her parties, with her in the center of the second frame. And what I mean when I say I stayed quiet is that sometimes the kindest way to avoid a scream is to let a bell ring in a closed tower and trust that sound will carry. There is a petty part of me that wanted to claw back the narrative in ways that would leave scratches, and I fed that part something harmless instead, which is how the morning birthed its own small, satisfying sting. I bought a domain that looked suspiciously like the 3-word phrase Madison had stamped across her late-night post, having another, again, hyphenated just so to be legally clean. And I pointed it to a very gentle landing page for the women's shelter 2 neighborhoods over that runs a diaper bank and a program to help mothers leave apartments where doors get slammed too hard. And I wrote a neat little caption on my feed about how any surplus joy from last night could be translated into formula vouchers for families whose parties have not included confetti in a long time, and I left the link in my bio for exactly 1 day. It was, I admit, a pointed translation of vanity into groceries, but it was also genuinely useful, and by evening the shelter's director had messaged me with gratitude and numbers that looked like the inside of a miracle, and when I checked the donor list I saw 3 surnames that share my blood and 1 first name that shares my sister's nickname, which told me she had felt the nudge even if she would never say it out loud. People think revenge is a finish line you sprint across while a crowd roars, but the better kinds are quiet, almost administrative, like moving a decimal to the place it should have been all along. And as I wiped the counter and packed my tote for the afternoon errands, I let myself picture Madison's face at the moment she realized how the day was going to slide away from her no matter how hard she grabbed for the edges. And then I filed that picture in the mental drawer labeled Mercy because there are still more levers to pull and I have no interest in burning down a house I might someday want my child to visit. Besides, the announcement she could not stop has only done half of its work, and the other half, what it means for holidays, for keys, for names written on paper that outlasts applause, will require a conversation none of us has ever had while looking each other in the eye, which is why, just as I was reaching for my coat, my phone buzzed again with a new message from a number I did not expect, and the single sentence on the screen froze me long enough that the egg in the pan went from sunny to firm. The number on my screen was not saved under a name, which usually means spam or a dentist reminding me I am overdue, yet the sentence was too deliberate to be a blast. Recording confirmed at 8. The county stamp will appear online by afternoon. Congratulations, and as soon as I read it I felt that peculiar weightless drop you get on a small-town roller coaster when you forget it even has a second hill, because in that tidy line lived months of cautious conversations across the scratched surface of my grandmother's kitchen table, the soft thud of manila folders, the muttered arithmetic of taxes and maintenance and roofs that need attention before winter decides to be mean, and the deeply unfancy relief of doing something the long way so no one can accuse you of cutting a corner. I texted back a thank you that did not use punctuation in case Madison ever demanded to see my phone, then slid it into my pocket and stared at the egg, now completely firm, and thought about how many holidays had been staged in houses that were no one's responsibility and, therefore, everyone's problem, and how different a room feels when the keys are not theoretical. If you grow up in a family like ours, where tradition arrives like a casserole you did not ask for and stays until the plastic lid warps, you learn that the house is not a building so much as a magnet, and my grandmother's bungalow had always been that magnet, holding together birthdays and Thanksgivings and the sort of Tuesday nights when someone needed advice about a mechanic, but after she passed, and the will did that blunt, old-fashioned thing of naming my mother as executor with a nudge toward keeping it in the family, the bungalow became a shrine to indecision, empty and echoing, while Madison floated ideas about turning it into a content space with light, airy vibes, and my mother stalled because she is polite to a fault. And my father measured studs as if they might change height if he waited, and I started bringing coffee to Mr. Halpern, the lawyer who still writes reminders on index cards with a fountain pen, just to see what the process would actually be if someone chose process over performance. Every visit added a small stone to a careful pile, title, appraisal, inspection, a modest loan shaped to fit inside our budget instead of impress anyone at a barbecue, and each stone, frankly, felt like an apology to every ancestor who ever kept a roof from leaking without an audience. When I say my announcement went live, I do not mean I posted a picture of a key on a velvet ribbon with a florist's caption, although I could have, and it would have pulled likes like a magnet pulls paper clips. I mean that a scheduled post, written in language plain enough to read out loud at a school board meeting, explained that we had closed on a house that would not be a museum, but a working hub, that certain holidays and Sunday dinners would now live there by default unless weather or health said otherwise, that the letters from the shower would sit in a tin on the mantel until the day those dates line up with the numbers on the envelopes, that the pantry would keep a standing list for anyone who needed to grab a bag of staples without asking permission, and that, for family transparency, the house sat in a trust with me as the boring, accountable trustee and my parents as primary stewards, all of which is about as sexy as a spreadsheet and twice as powerful because it steals exactly the oxygen Madison hoards, uncertainty, and replaces it with calendar entries and locks that click. I knew what Madison had expected, because she thinks in spotlights and assumes legacy is a costume change, so when my phone buzzed with a stream of her texts about stealing her moment and weaponizing Grandma, I did not bother to pretend I was surprised. I was at the bungalow by then, unlocking the side door with a key that made the old brass sigh like a grandmother deciding to let you in even though you are late, and I walked through those rooms that still smelled faintly of lemon oil and Avon and winter soup, setting down the bag of new dish towels, taping small labels inside cabinet doors so people will stop opening 5 drawers to find the corkscrew, and propping the mantel with the tin of letters we had collected under the projector while Madison tried to pivot the night to her belly. On the dining table I laid out 6 plain envelopes with names in my neat block script: Mother, Father, Aunt Linda, Uncle Peter, Grandma Doris's neighbor who knows who fixes furnaces for cheap, and one that said Madison, because I have never believed in banishing anyone from a story they helped write, no matter how messy their penmanship has been. The envelopes held keys on simple rings and a single sheet titled Sunday Suppers, printed like a church bulletin with dates and tasks that read as invitations rather than assignments. Because I have learned there is a difference between telling people where to sit and making the seats obvious, and in Madison's envelope, alongside the key, I tucked a card with 3 lines, each one straightforward in a way that felt more radical than shouting. First, that the house would host News We Celebrate, without stealing anyone else's oxygen. Second, that announcements live at the ends of toasts, not the beginnings, which leaves room for cake and for people. Third, that we would love to have her at the table every time she can come, provided she agrees to those first 2 lines and brings something besides a spotlight, perhaps a salad that feeds more than one. It was not a punishment so much as a blueprint for air, and, because I am not made of stone, I added a postscript about the playpen we had, stored in the hall closet with her oldest in mind, labeled with his nickname, to say that boundary and welcome can live on the same shelf. By the time the family arrived, summoned with a neutral group text about picking up a few of Grandma's things that wisely did not invite debate, the sun had turned the dining room warm and the neighbor had dropped off a bundt cake that tasted like someone finally said yes. And I handed out envelopes like party favors designed by a municipal clerk, which is exactly my aesthetic when the goal is peace. My parents cried again, for different reasons this time, relief mostly, and my father bent the keyring open with that little wrist twist that says he has done this 1,000 times, while Aunt Linda read the Sunday supper sheet out loud as if it were a hymn. And Madison stood near the doorway with her purse strap held too tight and an expression like she had walked onto a stage where the script had been rewritten in a language she has not bothered to learn. I stepped toward her and offered the envelope, and she hesitated, then took it as if it might object, and I watched her red cheeks coloring, eyes cutting at me on the second rule, mouth tightening at the third, before she slid the key into her pocket with a furious little grace, and I knew she understood that a locked door can be kinder than a crowd. Before anyone could grandstand, I clinked a water glass with a butter knife, the old trick that still works because sound organizes attention, and thanked everyone for showing up on a Sunday with short notice, promising I would keep it brief because the roast would turn if we got sentimental. Then I told them what the county stamp would show by afternoon and what the trust documents meant in practical terms, and where the spare batteries would live. And I did it in that steady, checklist rhythm that makes even anxious people relax, and when I finished I folded the printed agenda like a receipt and slid it into my pocket, which is when Madison, whose radar for attention is as sensitive as a thermostat in January, blurted that this felt like a coup. And I smiled the way you smile at a toddler who has named lunchtime a conspiracy, and I told her we had simply moved a recurring meeting from the group chat to a real table with chairs, and that she could either sit or send her regrets. And then, because revenge works best when you keep it taxable, I flipped the little chalkboard by the door from closed to open in white squeaky letters, a quiet ceremony no camera can hijack. And the room applauded not like an audience, but like a neighborhood that has finally decided on trash day. By noon the county site updated with the dry little line that changes everything, 2 surnames in block caps, a parcel number, the word trust tucked in like a seatbelt. And within minutes my mother was texting me screenshots with more exclamation points than she has ever used about anything except grandbabies, while my father, who treats civic websites like sacred texts, called to confirm he could see the stamp from his own laptop as if the truth needed a second witness, and over all that digital rustle came Madison again, the voice raw from the kind of crying that lives right under anger, telling me I had humiliated her by turning Grandma's house into a board meeting and making rules like a HOA nobody voted for. Which made me laugh in a way that annoyed her more than if I had shouted, because nothing frightens Madison like realizing the scene she wrote for me does not fit the room I am standing in. I told her the truth without seasoning. That a house becomes a circus if you do not post a schedule, and that sitting at a table on Sundays was not a revolution, but a mercy that would keep casseroles warm and fights short, and she hung up again with the kind of theatrical sigh that means she has a second audience somewhere. Probably the group chat she keeps half private like a backup stage. I am not naive about optics, and I know there is a version of me in her head that is colder than I am, a woman who forces laminated rules on people who just wanted cake. And I can hear the chorus that says I should have let time do the smoothing instead of picking up a sander. Yet there is also the math I could no longer ignore. The way our gatherings had become hazard zones for last-minute announcements. The way my pulse spiked every time someone lifted a glass for a quick note. The way love gets noisy and then brittle when no one is staring, and I am allowed to want my child's first memories to involve a pot roast that arrives hot and a table where nobody reaches for a microphone. Still, because I have learned that control becomes ugly when it is only about winning, I folded a small give into the day that made even me wince and then breathe easier. Which is that I called the events manager from the shower and booked the same hall for Madison's reveal party with the deposit already paid, on a date that would give her plenty of time to enjoy being the center without knocking over anyone else's cake. And I texted her the confirmation number with a simple line, "You get the room. We get the Sunday." Which is the nicest boundary I have ever written and the most aggressive kindness she will ever receive from me. Her reply, 30 words about me trying to buy her off, a few about how I cannot choreograph real life, was as predictable as rain on a parade, and I let it pass through because other levers needed pulling. Some of them explicitly designed to make her usual strategies less profitable. The first was a practical note I slid into the family chat announcing that all filming inside the bungalow would require a heads-up and a soft, no ads policy, which would guard us from waking up as background characters on one of Madison's monetized family reels without banning joy, and before anyone could accuse me of policing nostalgia for sport, I attached a link to a simple calendar where people could claim cooking nights or drop off groceries for the pantry. A system so boring it becomes bulletproof, and I watched as Aunt Linda took the first Wednesday, and my father volunteered for leaf raking, and my mother, bless her relentless heart, added birthday card stockpile, under supplies with 5 names already listed and 1 question mark that looked suspiciously like a truce. The second lever was pettier and therefore, to me, more satisfying, because it took Madison's favorite thing, buzz, and turned it into diapers like alchemy. I repurposed the domain I had bought after her late-night post to host a meals train style page that matched people who wanted to celebrate my news with families on a waiting list at the shelter, and I made the whole thing feel less like a charity drive and more like a block party where you get assigned a potato salad, which meant the participation rate rocketed in a way that warmed me more than any headline ever could. By evening, the shelter had messaged to say 6 mothers would not worry about formula this month, and 1 landlord had returned a deposit after a phone call he would not describe, and when I saw my father's name on the list next to Costco Run, I thought, not for the first time, that you can build a culture with small tasks as easily as with speeches. When the family drifted in for an impromptu christening of the kitchen, my mother with dish towels, my father with batteries, Aunt Linda with a casserole that could feed a pickup basketball team, Madison arrived late, wearing sunglasses inside like a movie star hiding from a matinee crowd, and stood in the doorway just long enough for everyone to notice before stepping toward the mantel where the tin of letters sat like a quiet heartbeat. She did not touch it, which told me something was still intact under the anger. And when I handed her the printed no ads note to sign with the rest of us, nothing legal, just a courtesy agreement stapled to a calendar, she read it with a scoff, then signed on the line with a flourish big enough to be a threat, and slipped the pen back into my shirt pocket like I was the concierge at a hotel she would review poorly. I thanked her in a voice so even it made my father glance at me, and I cannot pretend I did not enjoy the small arc of power in that moment. The sense that we had moved the furniture of our lives so the heavy things finally sat on studs. For dessert, I passed around a plate of lemon bars and, because I am not entirely made of mercy, I mentioned that the city had approved our application to place my grandmother's simple plaque by the old oak, no commercial filming without family consent. A sentence polite enough to hide teeth, which drew a couple of laughs and 1 visible wince from Madison, and then I led a toast that asked for patience while we learned how to be a family in a different key, the kind of line that makes half a room tear up and the other half check their phones under the table. When people began to leave, the house felt less like a battlefield and more like a church basement after a successful fundraiser. Tired, sticky, satisfied. And I stayed back to stack plates and wipe the table where my grandmother had taught me to sign my name in cursive, and that is when my phone lit up with a message from Mr. Halpern, the lawyer who files things as if someone is grading him, asking whether I wanted him to deliver the envelope from Doris, now that the stamp had posted, or if I preferred to open it when the household contains two newborns. A line so specific and strange that I sat down hard on the kitchen chair and felt every choice I had made slide into a new shape I could not yet see. I met Mr. Halpern in his office that smells like pencil shavings and courthouse dust, and he slid the thick envelope across the desk with the reverence of a church usher handling the collection plate, explaining in that measured voice that my grandmother had left a set of instructions that would sound odd until they made perfect sense, that the contents were not a will addendum, but a family device, a contraption built from paper and love and a little mischief to force two stubborn daughters to look at each other rather than at whichever camera happened to be closest, and when I broke the flap and pulled out the first sheet, the line at the top bent my breath the way a strong wind does when you step out of a revolving door. Open when the household contains two newborns, written in that slanted script Grandma Doris used for recipe cards and apologies, while the pages beneath revealed a logic that was so plain it felt radical, because she had created twin education bonds and a modest fund for Sunday dinners and roof repairs, all of it locked behind a requirement that the mothers of the two babies sign together, in ink, in the same room, under a paragraph that outlawed public announcements during private milestones, banned monetizing children on any platform without unanimous consent, and handed the calendar privileges not to a single person but to a rotating pair of custodians who would change every season like daylight savings, which meant any power play would last roughly as long as a pot of coffee. I laughed, not because it was a joke, but because it was such a precise fix for a very American disease, the one where family turns into content and content turns into currency and memory gets priced by the view. And then I stopped laughing because the clause about two newborns made my chest tight with the sort of math you do when you know one variable and the other might be smoke. So I asked Mr. Halpern whether the line required twins or simply two new humans under one roof. And he said my grandmother refused to define it more than that, believing that women understand thresholds better than men who write definitions for a living, and I took the packet home like contraband, hid it behind the flour canister on the bungalow counter, and stood in the kitchen trying to decide which was more likely, that Madison was bluffing because the room had not clapped loudly enough, or that she was pregnant and frightened and would rather fight me than feel anything else for 5 minutes. By late afternoon, the family drifted back in that casual Sunday way where errands detour into coffee, and I waited until the coats were on the hooks and the casserole had started to perfume the hallway before I set the envelope on the table like a second centerpiece, explaining in calm sentences that Grandma Doris had set aside help for babies and boilers, that she had also set aside a rule book disguised as common sense, and that the one catch was a signature ceremony to be performed by the two mothers when the house held two babies at once, which made my father beam as if logistics were love, which, for him, they are, and made my mother press her lips together in the way she does when relief and memory collide, and then, right on cue, as if summoned by stage direction, Madison walked in, sunglasses pushed to the top of her head, jaw set in that defiant angle that has broken more than one glass at dinner, and paused when she saw the envelope like she had spotted an animal on the trail, and was deciding whether it would bite. I did not say her name first, because saying a name sometimes sounds like an accusation, and instead I read Grandma's paragraph about microphones and cake in a voice that tried to be funny and failed, then slid the pen across the table and pointed to the two signature lines and said that I would sign now because one newborn was warming up under my ribs and would be here soon enough, and that the second line would live in the tin with the letters until the day she brought a baby through the door. Whether that meant a stroller or a car seat or a long, tired exhale and a bassinet dropped by the couch, and I told her, quietly enough that only the salt shaker heard the wobble in my tone, That I did not care whether she had counted weeks correctly last night or simply needed to win the room for a minute, because the house does not care about page views. It cares about whether people show up with groceries and kindness and a towel for the wet dog, and that the bonds and the roof fund would remain locked until we made eye contact over a baby's head and sign like grown women who understand that power shared is stability earned. She stared at the lines, eyes bright with something I could not sort, anger or fear or the ache that shows up just before truth does, and then, in one of those turns that separate a performance from a life, she took the pen, uncapped it with her teeth like she was buying time, and asked me, not sarcastically for once, whether the rule about no monetizing meant zero, like absolutely none, not even the sweet monthly update posts with matching onesies that brands beg for, and I told her yes, zero. A clean zero that keeps our babies from becoming spokespeople for soap, and she barked out a laugh that sounded like a cough and said I was cruel in a way that might save us, and while she looked at the empty line my phone buzzed with a private message from her. Not a text, but a draft screenshot of a post titled Correction, the caption admitting she had let excitement carry her mouth while the tests were inconclusive, the comments turned off, the publish button unpressed. I watched her thumb hover between the pen and the phone, and I said nothing because anything I said would be the wrong thing, and after a long, bent minute she slid the phone face down, tucked the pen behind her ear like a waitress getting back to work, and told me to put the envelope in the tin where it belonged for now, because she would rather prove the line true than sign it as fiction, and then she lifted a dish towel, tied it at her waist, and asked where I kept the roasting pan like she had never used a microphone in her life, which should have felt like an ending and instead felt like the kind of beginning that refuses to announce itself out loud, the kind you only recognize years later when a ceiling stops leaking, a Sunday night smells like food, and two frames on the mantel remain empty on purpose until the day we decide that a name written in ink means more than a laugh written in air.